Today we are presenting on the Me Too movement and doing social change case analysis for our social change practicum course with Dr. Scott Evans. My name is Natalie Josipovich.
And my name is Andrea Botero.
So what is Me Too? So Me Too is not just a hashtag, it's an international movement to support survivors and end sexual violence. It encompasses a movement created in 2006 by founder Tarana Burke.
Okay, so let's talk about the story of now. What is the problem? According to a National Intimate Partner in Sexual Violence, the survey that they did in 2010, 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men will be raped at some point in their lives. Also, 92% of female rape victims know their perpetrator. 81% of women and 35% of men report significant short or long-term impacts such as post-traumatic stress disorder. The lifetime long cost is over $122,000 per victim. Rape is the most underreported crime. 63% of sexual assaults are not reported to police. 81% of women and 43% of men have experienced some form of sexual harassment during their lifetime.
So now we're going to go through the history of the Me Too movement. So in 1997, while Burke was working in a youth camp, a 13-year-old girl approached her, telling her that her mother's boyfriend was sexually abusing her. Tarana wasn't able to help her and encouraged her to reach out to another female counselor who could help her better. But Burke felt a lot of guilt as a survivor of sexual violence herself and wished that she had the courage to tell this girl, me too, I'm also a survivor of sexual violence. Many years later, in 2006, she founded Just Be Inc., a nonprofit organization focused on the health, well-being, and wholeness of young women of color. The Me Too movement started as a program of this nonprofit organization to help survivors of sexual violence, particularly young women of color from low-wealth communities, find pathways to healing by understanding that they are not alone in their journey. They wanted to build a coalition of survivors. Then we skip forward to January 2017. We see that immediately following President Trump's inauguration, women around the world marched to send a bold message to our new administration on their first day in office and to the world that women's rights are human rights. They held up signs such as "Pussy grabs back," referring to statements that President Trump had made previously, and it created a large women's movement. In October 2017, we see Ashley Judd accusing media mogul Harvey Weinstein of sexual assault in a breaking story by the New York Times, and many other celebrities following suit, saying that they also had experienced sexual assault from this man. In only 10 days later, we see actress Alyssa Milano reigniting the Me Too with a tweet. If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too as a reply to this tweet. And it quickly turned into a viral campaign with people hashtagging Me Too. On January 1st, 2018, more than 300 women of Hollywood formed an anti-harassment, assault, and inequality coalition called Time's Up. And in April 26, 2018, Bill Cosby was convicted of drugging and molesting a woman in the first big celebrity trial of the Me Too era. We saw a lot of other celebrities being accused and convicted of sexual violence, and we also want to make sure when we're presenting this history to mention that the gaps in the timeline are not proportional to the amount of time passed. And these are only a few of the major events that happened, but there are many other important events that happened in the Me Too movement. So with leadership, we have Tarana Burke, as we mentioned, the founder of the Me Too movement in 2006. She's also the founder of Just Be Inc., which we had also mentioned was a nonprofit organization she founded, and a senior director of Girls for Gender Equity. Now, we also have the Silence Breakers. These are the celebrities and thousands of people that joined the viral campaign. The name Silence Breakers was associated with a Time magazine issue of Time Person of the Year, in which the Silence Breakers were named the Time Person of the Year of 2017. It's important to notice that there is a misalignment between what is being stated between Tarana Burke and the actual actions and efforts of the movement. We'll discuss that later in the critique section. It's also important to notice when we're acknowledging the silence breakers, a few of them, actually many of them, created a legal defense fund, and it's a group of 300 women in the entertainment industry, and their purpose is to challenge systemic power imbalances in the workplace. So the membership. We see the membership of the movement being very complex, especially because there's so many people involved just because of the use of the hashtag. We see the hashtag creating alliances between celebrities and activists. We see that in the picture in the Grammys in the top right corner. We also see the hashtag MeToo being used in the Women's March. And sorry, it was the Golden Globes Awards, not the Grammys. And it's important to notice that the Me Too movement is not just a movement of women. The primary membership of the movement is that it's a movement for survivors. Also important to notice is the strategies that are used by the movement. We have Alyssa Milano's tweet that catalyzed the hashtag, where she wrote the top tweet on the top left corner. And October 15th was the date she posted that. In that one day, more than 500,000 tweets were posted on Twitter with the hashtag. More than 12 million posts were posted on Facebook with the hashtag in 85 different countries.
Okay, so the Me Too movement started in the US. However, the momentum has been used to catalyze women's movement that have been working to advance women's rights in countries around the world. A few countries that have been highlighted in this map include Nigeria. Because Boko Haram opposes female education, women's groups created safe spaces for girls to study. They also organized protests outside embassies to keep up the pressure on the Nigerian government to ensure the return of all who have been kidnapped. As of January 2018, roughly 140 of these girls have escaped or been exchanged through mediation. The activists involved with the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls started a global conversation and brought partners from all corners of the world to speak out about violence against women and human trafficking. In China, a woman started a poll on WeChat, a popular messaging app in China, in which 255 female journalists shared their experience, and more than 80% reported that they have been sexually harassed, most on multiple occasions. And last week in Argentina, we have another example. So they just passed a bill to decriminalize abortion. All of these are things that were catalyzed by the Me Too movement.
So we're going to stop talking about the Me Too movement and have the founder of the Me Too movement share in her own words what the movement is doing.
Hi, my name is Tarana Berg, and I'm the founder of the Me Too movement. We founded Me Too over a decade ago to support young women of color in the community we live who were survivors of sexual violence. In the years since we started, we've expanded to support adults and people across the gender spectrum who have been holding the trauma of sexual violence for many, many years. Now, since the expansion or explosion of Me Too in 2017, we have a unique opportunity to expand our platform and continue a national conversation around sexual violence in this country and countries around the world. But we want to be clear about what the Me Too movement is about. There's lots of conversation about it being about taking down powerful men or about targeting people, and it's not about any of those things. This is a movement about giving people access to a healing journey, to make sure the most marginalized amongst us have an opportunity to start a pathway to healing from the trauma of sexual violence. It's also a movement about radical community healing. We believe that communities have to come together to make them safe and to protect the most vulnerable people from sexual violence. We do this through two ideas. One is called empowerment through empathy. We believe in the power of empathy to support people. When two people exchange the words Me Too, it is literally an exchange of empathy between people that says, I hear you, I see you, and I believe you. Once people have that, it gives them permission to start a healing journey. And that's what we're about. The other idea is radical community healing. And that means that in all the ways that sexual violence is allowed to flourish in our communities, we want to work against that. Ultimately, this is a movement about eradicating sexual violence. We want to teach people how to lean into their joy so that they can move away from the trauma. And we want to teach people that we can, as a collective, interrupt sexual violence wherever it lives. And we want to do that together. We need everybody doing all the work they can in all the ways they can to interrupt sexual violence. And we invite you to join us.
All right, so we're going to articulate the vision as we saw on the Me Too website of the Me Too movement. So by bringing vital conversations about sexual violence into the mainstream, Me Too is helping to destigmatize survivors by highlighting the breadth and impact sexual violence has on thousands of women and helping those who need it to find entry points to healing. Ultimately, with survivors at the forefront of this movement, Me Too is aiding the fight to end sexual violence by disrupting all systems that allow sexual violence to flourish.
Okay, the theory of change of the Me Too movement. So we have crafted this theory of change that we're going to show you based on the stated vision of the Me Too movement that they show in the website and also in some videos that Tarana Burke has appearing in media. So as we heard her, they start having conversations about sexual violence. That is the precondition of highlighting the breadth and impact sexual violence has on thousands of individuals. Let's remember, it's not only women, it's also men and other population. Also, having conversations about sexual violence will give space to speak of the needs of a broader spectrum of survivors, and victims will understand that they are not alone in their circumstances. This line of these steps will be preconditions for destigmatization of survivors, also to provide resources for sexual assault survivors and allies, and it will bring space for the healing process to victims, and victims will turn into survivors. And this will be precondition for a community of survivors is built and perpetrators are held accountable. So Tarana Burke explained that bringing down powerful sexual offenders was never the movement's primary goal. The main objective of the movement is to support survivors, to help them heal, and allow them into a place of leadership. However, the actions of the movement contradict this statement. For example, the founder of the movement, Tarana Burke, was one of the dominant voices in the movement to mute R. Kelly because of sexual assault allegations toward young women of color. So that is why this step is, or this box is in gray. So if all of this is precondition for survivors to become thrivers and to create a power base that carry on the fight. This will bring survivors and advocates to create solutions to interrupt sexual violence in their community. That will bring survivors to disrupt systems that allow global proliferation of sexual violence, and finally, and will ultimately see the end of sexual violence. So in practice, we see the first 4 levels of the theory of change being met. However, we believe the movement has to work on the execution of the last steps of the theory of change, as there is a big leap of faith between the final steps of the theory. We also believe there are missing steps within the theory of change, which we'll later identify in our critique.
So now we'll talk about the strategies and tactics being used by the Me Too movement. So we first have this idea of talking about sexual violence. Andrea mentioned it in her theory of change slide previously, but talking about the breadth and impact sexual violence has on thousands of women through the use of the hashtag Me Too. We also see empowerment through empathy. Tarana Burke mentioned that in her video, but to reiterate, it's the belief in the power of empathy to support people in finding their paths toward healing. Finally, we see radical community healing being a stated goal. Tarana Burke mentions it in the video we showed before. But again, to reiterate, it's working against structures that have allowed sexual violence to flourish in our communities. So some successes of the movement. So it's brought awareness to the prevalence of sexual assault and harassment through the hashtag again. It's connected sexual assault survivors to resources that claim to help their healing processes. We see that in the website for the Me Too movement provides different resources for sexual violence survivors. And we also see resources for women in movements that have come out of the Me Too movement, such as the Time's Up movement. It also holds perpetrators of sexual violence accountable, especially perpetrators that have committed acts of sexual violence towards powerful white women. We see that in the celebrity world with a lot of celebrities that are being held accountable, but we see that less in political spheres and also in vulnerable communities of color particularly. We also see that the movement has provided an open community for survivors to identify and connect with, open in the sense that anyone can access information about who's using the hashtag if they have a public profile. They're able to connect with, maybe not physically, but at least virtually, to these people and know that there are other people that have similar experiences to them. It's also inspired organizations like Time's Up. Again, Time's Up gives legal and PR assistance to victims of sexual misconduct in the workplace. And it also has strengthened feminist campaigns and movements around the world, as Andrea mentioned in her slide with how Me Too movements have catalyzed different movements around the world.
Next, we will present our critique and recommendations for the Me Too movement.
So we see key elements the movement is missing based on the key elements that Pastor had identified in his article that he wrote in 2009. Pastor is a professor who studied a number of social movements, including Black Lives Matter. And the elements that he describes in this document that are missing is an underlying and viable economic model, a pragmatic policy package, the capacity to research, frame, and communicate the issue, which is sexual violence, ability to strategically assess power, the capacity to manage large and growing organizations, and the capability to engage and network with others.
Okay, so one of our critiques is limited focus on individuals. So the Me Too movement claims to have the goal of transforming system, but the general perception of the movement is one that is focused on holding perpetrators accountable for acts of sexual assault, and also the healing of victims. This last objective is achieved through something that Tarana Burke defined as empowerment through empathy. Someone could think this is community empowerment. However, our opinion is this empowerment has a limited focus on individuals and is not building community capacity. Neither it is organizing citizens to build power to fight for their rights, as Professor Evans mentioned in our lecture. The Me Too movement could take advantage of their momentum to address systems reform, build community capacity, and talk about the root causes of sexual violence and gender oppression. For example, one of the things the Me Too movement could work on is to help people understand that sexual violence is caused by a systemic problem and not the result of perpetrators' moral or psychological failing, and a victim's inability to ensure her or his safety. In order to achieve this, the movement needs to frame the problem in different ways by focusing on social change strategy on institutions and not individuals. Other critique we have is that they need to move beyond public awareness to action. So once the Me Too movement starts framing the problem differently, it's time to change the strategies of how to achieve social change and act. Raising awareness about something that wasn't known before can be a useful tactic when it's part of a larger effort to drive social change. People are tired of all the awareness campaigns that organizations and movements do. There is a need of a clear call to action, and the Me Too movement is just focusing on the healing of the victims. In addition, timing has to be carefully managed because a campaign can peak too quickly, exhausting everyone, and then fall into decline. As Professor Evans explained in class, there are three framings for social movement that have been described by Benford and Snow in 2000. These three framings are: first, the agnostic framing, which identifies the problem and its causes. The Me Too movement should specify the systems that perpetuate the global proliferation of sexual violence, as the Me Too movement vision states. The prognostic framing identifies the possible solutions to a problem and its strategies. The Me Too movement should create an action plan that addresses the systemic problems and not only individual problems. Additionally, as Schultz and Sandy explained, the movement should create an action plan that puts pressure on target, includes specific demand, and educates the member and develop leaders. Unfortunately, as we heard from Tarana Burke, the action plan is mostly focused on the healing of the victims, but there is no action plan that explains how the movement will eradicate sexual violence. The last framing, motivational framing, is how the movement uses a vocabulary of urgency to call for a collective action. The Me Too movement should provide a clear call to arms. In other words, they are missing a story of now, which is the moment in which story why and strategy how overlap, as Gans explained.
So another critique that we have found of this movement is the organization and leadership of the Me Too movement. Our perception is that the Me Too movement lacks structure and is not empowering leaders. Tarana Burke is the only face of the movement that we see, especially on the website, and we don't see that the movement has collective responsibility or a collective identity. It doesn't seem that the movement is going much beyond the hashtag, and it seems that it's privileging her voice over others. We don't see other people representing the movement in the same way that she is. And as stated by Gantz in 2010, social movements are organized by identifying, recruiting, and developing leadership at all levels. We don't see this happening for the Me Too movement, and we know that this is crucial for a movement to be sustainable. It's also important for us to recognize a discrepancy between what the website states and what's being said in interviews about the Me Too movement by Tarana Burke and what's actually being given in terms of resources. So in the website for the Me Too movement, we see that resources are dedicated only to women located in the US, even though Tarana Burke is stating that it's an international movement, and even in the vision statement on the website, it states an international movement, but we see problems when they aren't providing international resources.
We acknowledge that the Me Too movement is just starting. Well, it started in 2006. However, it got the momentum started last year, and we know that they still have a lot of time to improve their strategies. And we think that if they take into account our recommendations, they could do a great job to end sexual violence.
We have reached the end of our presentation. We thank you for your time and feedback and hope you have a wonderful summer. Here are resources, our first page of resources, and our second page. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.